why you have no signal. Oh, there you go.
There we go.
Push the right button.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, thank you. I wanted to talk about Holly registration, and in some ways, this is sort of my own journey of trying to figure out why we do registration, how we do registration, and how it came to be what it is today. I've been the registrar now for 2 years, and I've learned a lot along the way, but it's really because of what people have done before me. So to go back in history of why we have registration, you really have to go back to about the 1950s, when things were, I think for lack of a better word, chaotic in the world of horticulture. There was almost no set of rules on how you named plants. And when there were rules, people didn't follow them. When a superior cultivar came about and got into the hands of propagators, a lot of times those propagators, everybody who had a nursery and could grow a cutting, put their own name on the same thing. So the same plant was out there under 3 or 4 similar and sometimes completely dissimilar names. It became a marketing ploy, perhaps, and a predecessor to what we call trade names today in many ways. But it was chaotic. It was like the wild, wild west of horticulture. And this was happening across all plants. It was horrendous in roses, for example. And there was such a thing as the International Society for Horticultural Science that recognized this. And in the 1950s, they came up with the idea to establish a set of rules and gatekeepers for each major plant genus where cultivars were being established. And they said, let's set up an International Cultivar Registration Authority, the ICRA, for each genus. And the ICRAs would control the naming of the cultivars, avoiding duplication and providing clarity, and perhaps following the same set of rules so that we all use the same terminologies. The ICRAs could be plant societies, they could be academic institutions, they could be arboreta. It was wherever you could find people who were willing to organize the mess of horticultural names. These ICRAs were not to pass judgment on the quality of the cultivars, but just to keep track of things, to establish records. In the days before we used the word database, they created databases. In some cases, these were card files, for example. And this would be voluntary. There were no legal implications. There was no one who would come and raid your nursery if you didn't follow the rules. But in those days, a lot of people were interested in following the rules because they realized that this was really getting out of hand. The ICRA system that was set up established what are today about 80 different ICRAs. There's one for oaks that comes out of the Morton Arboretum in Chicago, for example. There's one for African violets. They're keeping track of 14,000 different cultivar names. There's one for hostas, which I think is the one that I admire the most. I spent a lot of time on the phone talking to the registrar for the American Hosta Society. And they even helped me to register that hosta down there. That was my first and only foray into registering a hosta. Their approaches vary according to the plant and the kind of things that are peculiar to that genus. And each of the ICRAs has to report back periodically, every few years, perhaps every 3 years. It was 5 stretched out because of the pandemic, in order to maintain their status. And so previous registrars with the Holly Society have had to make periodic reports. The Holly Society became the ICRA for the genus Ilex in the 1950s. And not because they sought it out, but because they were approached by the International Horticultural Congress that was meeting in the Netherlands. They found out about this relatively new society. Remember, the Holly Society was only formed in 1947, so it was only a few years old. In 1955, they wrote to the Holly Society of America and invited them to become the ICRA for the genus Ilex. And our society accepted that. And like every other good organization, they appointed a committee to figure out how to do the job. Our first committee, our first, what we would call the Registrar, was Dr. John Wister, a very famous horticulturist and botanist at Swarthmore at the Scott Arboretum. And after a couple of years of study, they began to survey the world of horticulture in hollies and recognized that, first of all, there were a lot of hollies being introduced. They counted in 2 years, 1956 to 57, 91 new hollies, or at least new holly names, that were appearing either in horticultural literature or more often catalogs, plant catalogs. And they recognized that a lot of these were probably duplicates. They might not be unique, but after going out and reaching out to these folks and saying, if you have a new one, we have this new process where your name will be officially recognized and registered with the Holly Society and gain some international status and standing. They only got 5 submitted for registration out of those 91. Why that was, I suspect in those days it was difficult to communicate and not as easy today as hitting the button on Facebook, for example. But by 1958, they had their first 2 registrations approved, and I don't expect you to be able to read this, but they thought it was really curious because although most of the time the Holly Society meetings were talking about American hollies and ways of growing American hollies for orcharding purposes and fertilizer needs for American hollies and pests of American hollies, the first 2 registrations were in fact Ilex cornuta. They were for Chinese hollies being grown really for the first time in the United States and entering the horticultural trade. And those first 2 were Xiu Ying and Dwarf Burford. They were registered in 1958. And the way that these registration numbers were made, the first number, the 1, referred to the first of the year to be registered, and then 58 referred to the year. There were those 2 in 1958. So the first one in 1959 would have been 1-59 and so on. And we followed that convention ever since. What we're going to do in the year 2058, I don't know. That'll be another guy's problem by then, I assume. The registrars went through a period, usually they worked for just a year or 2. They worked in the committee with the other folks in nomenclature, and usually through the 1960s, they were every couple of years they changed over. And almost all of these folks here were from academic institutions, primarily Rutgers University, and I think most of you who remember the Holly Society days of the 60s, 70s, 80s would remember Ellen Orton, who was a fixture in the organization. And they very much maintained this sort of academic approach to registration. There was kind of a gulf between the academics who knew the botanical side of things and the horticulturists who actually got dirt under their fingernails, grew the plants, and got them into the trade. These were all volunteers, and they've continued the tradition that goes on to today. But then all that changed in 1970 when Gene Eisenweiss became our registrar, succeeding Elwin Orton. He had been hired in 1963, and he was a true holly scientist. Hollies were his specialty. Most of these other folks were primarily known as specialists in other plants. But he became the registrar in 1970. He had authored, in the course of his career, over 200 publications on hollies, most of them through the U.S. National Arboretum in Washington. He established very detailed criteria on how we would describe hollies, very much like what we use today. And he began writing guides to registration, which are now even the ones we have that you can access on our website. He began to publish the registrations in the Holly Letter, and later, beginning in 1983, when we were publishing the Holly Society Journal for the first time, he began putting those registrations in there. And he also, in order to satisfy the requirements of the International Horticultural Society, put together a comprehensive list of every registration starting in 1958 up until the year 1993. There were 296 registrations by then, and Gene received the Shu Ying Hu Award for Scientific Excellence in recognition of the work that he did. Unfortunately for us, we lost Gene suddenly in 1997, and he was succeeded by Mike Ponte. I think a lot of you will know Mike Ponte very well. Mike became the registrar in 1997, succeeding Gene. He had assisted Gene and so understood what was required, and very quickly began to work on a large backlog of registrations. He registered 97 hollies through 2022. So Mike was our registrar for about 25 years. All the while he was working at Georgetown University. And here's a picture of Mike down here, and if you recognize who's standing there with Mike, that's you, Bob.
Is that me?
That's you. And I'm not sure what year that was, but I stole it off of an old Georgetown website.
Well, I worked with Mike at Georgetown from 1995 through 2003. So it's somewhere in that period.
Somewhere in there. Mike had me assisting him, and he showed me the way that he used templates for registering many of the holly species, and I was shocked and heartbroken when he said that he wanted to, quote unquote, retire from the job of registrar and asked me to take over the job from him. I said yes, I would do that on the condition that he stayed on to help me, which he has, and he is, although he is not here at this meeting, I wanted to recognize he's been very, very helpful to me in getting started and in offering me a lot of advice on how to handle some of the more difficult problems we faced. Mike maintained the Holly Society status as ICRA for the genus, and he was awarded the Shu Ying Hu Award in recognition of that work. So getting started, to register a holly, the name, it's really about the name primarily. And you can call a holly anything you want. There's no legal reason that you can't name it after your spouse or your dog or your home or yourself, for that matter. But for registration, you need to follow, there are a set of rules. The International Code of Nomenclature for Cultivated Plants, it's about a 300-page document. Only 2 or 3 pages really pertain to hollies. There are pages and pages on how you handle a registration, say, of an orchid or something like that. But it's the source of where we get our conventions, where we write the names in single quotes, for example, and do not italicize those. So we would write Ilex opaca, for example, in italics, but then a name like Cedar Hill is written not in italics and put in single quotes. There are also restrictions on the use of Latin names, for example. Latin cannot be used within the cultivar name because it would create confusion with the binomial nomenclature of the scientific name. For a holly, we do very much recommend you try to avoid confusion. And one of those ways that we confuse people all the time is by putting a male-sounding name on a female holly. Dan Fenton comes to mind, for example. We'd rather not have that. There's no law against it. You can name a holly anything you want, but for registration purposes, we strongly encourage you try to avoid that. And please do share the background. When you go to register, let's find out why you named it. We love to publish that. We think it adds an interesting story for interest purposes. One of the responsibilities of the ICRAs is to maintain a checklist, and we're required to track all the names that are used within the genus, whether they're registered or not. So remember in the case of the 1950s where 91 new names popped up in the trade, we're required to track those and to keep people from using them again so as to avoid confusion. And as Bob mentioned, Fred Galley's the genus Ilex, Holly's the genus Ilex, 1997, probably the most comprehensive work up to that point, listing the names of cultivars. And shortly after that, a suggestion from Bill Cool I received was, you really should put together a list of things that have happened beyond Galley. And that's how we began this. And at the time we thought there'd probably been almost, 20, 30 hollies, perhaps, introduced by then. Now we have over 500 in the Beyond Galley database. I brought a printed copy. It's now 124 pages long if you want to kill your printer and print it all out. It's really intended not for printing purposes, but for use as an online reference. And it will be available on our Holly Society website in the members only. So if you log in first, Rachel now has all the files to update the very latest, updated for this meeting, version of Beyond Galley. It's organized just like Galley by species and by hybrids, so that you can look for a name or some background information. If you pick up something from the auction, for example, you can read a little background about where it came from and so on. The registrar's job primarily is to write the holly description. That will include some original plant history, who introduced it, who discovered it, who named it, who selected it. Was it a chance seedling? Was it a branch sport or something like that? Some description of the original plant. How big did it grow? What's its shape? What's its growth habit? And so on. And then some detailed description of the leaves. And this is where we get into some of the more difficult botanical nomenclature. The size, the shape, the apex, the base, the leaf margins, and so on. A little bit about the blooming period. Is it an old wood bloomer or a new wood bloomer? For a female, of course, most of us grow hollies so that we can appreciate the fruits. How large are they? What color, and so on. Some comparison to other hollies. What makes this one unique? Is it really different, for example? Now, we don't pass judgment on that, but we do want to document it. Why the originator thought that it was worth naming and introducing. Propagation. Where can I get it? Has it gone out for sale anywhere? Has it appeared at our plant auction, for example? And where can I get cutting wood if I wanted to grow it myself? And most importantly today, color photos to help document it. So just as an example, so for registration details, the habit, if you have an American holly, it might be conical like this Seder Hill. It could be more broadly conical like Miss Helen. It could be prostrate like these Maryland dwarf shown growing here. Ilex crenata, a couple of examples. It might be a low rounded plant like soft touch or helleri, green meatballs in the landscape. Or it could be a tall, thin pillar like this emerald lady. That's Ellen Orton there in the picture standing beside it for scale. If we look at the largest leaves, the largest typical leaves, provide measurements both in inches and centimeters. That's Clarendon spreading and Maryland dwarf grown side by side, showing the typical difference. Although the plants, when young especially, may have a very similar habit, they are very different in terms of their leaf size. Leaf shape, here's a bit of a picture from Gene Eisenweiss's guide to holly registration that's still on our website. So this goes back to the early 1990s, giving shapes and descriptions. And so looking at this plant down here, Skinny Atlas, for example, would you call that an oblong or a lanceolate leaf? You can refer to some of these pictures as a guide. So here are a couple of examples. I always need to refer back to this because I have a hard time remembering the difference between ovate and obovate because I never learned Latin. But there's Maryland dwarf again, which is widest in the middle. Here's a seedling, which is widest at the base. Here's a cornuta, which is widest near the apex. And those are the kinds of words that we use in the descriptions to describe. Leaf margins on a holly are very characteristic, and although they are variable in the plant, we do like to document what the typical leaf type is. So we do a side view. This is the same leaf. We look in side view and we look in top view. Side view undulate, meaning it's going up and down like this. And we look at the shape of the leaf both without the spines. If you imagine this without the spines, it still has these lobes that go out. We use the word serrate, meaning saw-like, and then spinos for the spines, and usually what's the spine count? How many spines per side, for example, on these, and are they uniform or irregular? Here are some extreme examples of spinose margins. I'll just show those for interest. That one over there, pins and needles, is one that I would love to register someday. It's still in evaluation, and it is the most painful thing to propagate, I have to tell you. Very, very sharp. Oops. And then the leaf apex, the tip of the leaf, whether it is very narrowly pointed, where we might use words like acuminate or aristate, bristle-like even, acute, where it's angled to an angle less than 90 degrees, whether the tip is reflexed, turned downwards, as is typical in Ilex cornuta, for example. And then fruit size, as I mentioned, fairly interesting, especially nowadays as we begin to look more at native plants and their importance to wildlife. If you think about it, an American holly like Miss Helen is known for having very large fruit for an American holly, about 10 millimeters in diameter. In fact, it's rare to find an American holly with any fruit larger than 10 millimeters, and the documented reason for that is just about the size of the beak of a robin, which is important as a species that spreads the fruit around, that spreads the seeds around. So a plant that has berries much larger than 10 millimeters in diameter might be very pretty in your landscape, but it has no hope in evolutionary terms of passing those genes on because it's just not going to be spread by the birds. This is a more typical American holly. This one's Babs from Janet and Frank Schreiber. About 7 millimeters in diameter. That's perfect for the birds. And this one I threw in just because it's a strange one. That's a glabra, an inkberry, with only 3 millimeter diameter fruits. I have no idea why it does that, but I thought, oh, I have to take a picture of that at least. Color, this is one of the interesting things about registration. How do you describe color? It is one thing to say that the fruits are red or yellow or orange, or that the leaves are green. But how green, how red, is addressed using an international standard. The Royal Horticultural Society in London produces these color charts every few years. These are like glorified paint charts, like a Sherwin-Williams paint chart. The numbers correspond on these fans. So the red group in the red group number 40 through 44 includes subtle differences in red that you can usually match up the fruit color of this, for instance, Satyr Hill, with that. And this, when the fruit matures, is quite characteristic, and it has to do with the specific color pigments that Ilex is using to produce that red color. And so that's how those things are recorded. One thing that sets us apart compared to other plant societies, especially for herbaceous plants, is we collect standard specimens for preservation that can be used later as a reference. And this is Dr. Harlan Svoboda, who is the herbarium curator at the U.S. National Arboretum. He also serves on our registration committee. Harlan has been a tremendous, tremendous help to me. And one of the first things that Mike said is, I really need to introduce you to Harlan because he'll be a great help to you. He looks young because he is, but he is very enthusiastic. At the U.S. National Arboretum, they take our registration samples and preserve them for future study. We take the samples of male hollies when they are in flower, so that the flowers can be preserved, and females we take with fruit, so that those can be preserved for future study. At the Arboretum, at the U.S. National Arboretum, their herbarium has over 700,000 specimens, including, he counted them for me, 10,500 ilex, 372 species, and over 1,000 ilex cultivars there. They are unique among the herbaria of the world in that they specialize in collecting cultivar standards as opposed to merely wild collected samples. And when they receive a sample from us, they press and preserve it, a very detailed process, which allows a sample to be kept. And although that looks like just a dead plant to me, right? It's lost all its color and so on. The fine structure of the plant is perfectly preserved in the process that they follow. It's available in perpetuity. They have samples that are over 100 years old that look just like they first went into the collection. They're available for scientific examination. People can come from around the world and look at these and study them under microscopic examination. And most interestingly, today samples are available for DNA extraction. If you see up here in the corner, this little envelope, in the process of pressing and drying a sample like this, little pieces may break off. An extra leaf, a couple of the little fruits, a few broken flower bits, or it may be too long to preserve entirely. They'll preserve the extra little pieces in there. And then when we have a scientist who comes along and wants to do DNA study, for example, they can provide a little bit out of that envelope for DNA extraction and study. And as the science advances and new technology becomes available, that is becoming much more important. But the other thing that's very exciting, all 700,000 samples have now been imaged digitally with very ultra high resolution photography. These are now becoming available online beginning just last month, a few at a time. These will allow you to zoom in with the equivalent of, perhaps a 100 power magnification microscope. So if you need to count the hairs on the stem or something like that, you can do this online without having to go to Washington, D.C. to look at a sample. Pretty exciting. And that brings me to a mention of our first registration from China, from Yiping. This is Jingshan Princess, a smooth leaf branch sport of Sunny Foster. So it has no spines on the leaves, making it quite unique and quite valuable, particularly in the Chinese horticultural marketplace. And we've addressed the problem of being, it's very difficult to move specimens across international borders. And so for the meantime, standard specimens are at Yiping's institution, Nanjing Forestry University in China, where they can be studied. We're still working on trying to get samples transferred here as well. This, I hope, is the first of many from China, because there's a vibrant horticultural industry and research going on in China. They have perhaps 200 species of ilex there. We have very few here in comparison, and they have a wealth of material to work from. A registration becomes official once it's published, and we do that through our Holly Society Journal. And although a lot of us, I think, are sad that we no longer have paper copies of our journals being produced. The fact that they're now digital means we have unlimited access to pages and color, and we can put color photos of every new cultivar in our digital journal. That one is Nancy, shown there. And I believe, Rachel, the very next journal is coming out.
We'll be finishing it up soon.
It will be coming out very soon, and it will have Yiping's
Yes.
Jingshan Princess
Yes.
on the cover.
Yes.
The next one coming out.
Yeah.
So when should you register a holly? It used to be almost an unwritten rule that you couldn't register a holly until it was time, until you had gotten it out there and evaluated it, and lots of people had tried it, and they grew it up and saw whether they liked it, whether they could sell it, and so on. But the guidelines we say is once you've named it, if you think it's good enough to put a name on it, if it's good enough to propagate it, and you're ready to share it with others, let's get it registered. That way, people can know what they're getting. One important caveat is once it's bloomed. So that cutting right there, that's Blitzen. That's one of my my new favorites, but it won't bloom. It's now 7 years old. I would love to register it. I've been giving it away, bringing it to meetings like this, but soon I hope. Once you have registered this, the benefits. This is now an internationally recognized name for your holly. You get free publicity, if that matters to you. It goes in the Holly Society Journal with photos. It goes on our website. We put it on Facebook. And if we find a different way of publicizing, we'll put it there too. You get a registration certificate saying that we have accepted the registration, and you get bragging rights. You can show it to all your friends and say, I'm famous now. I have registered a holly. If I go about doing it, contact me. You can look online at the Holly Society website. You can see Gene Eisenweiss's old guidelines on how to name, how to describe, cards you could fill out if you wanted to save me the trouble of how many spines per side and what the shape of the leaf margin is and things like that. But the fact is you don't need to fill those out. Almost everything can be done now by email and by phone, online. An important caveat, you do not need to know the exact parentage of your holly. We have been registering lately a number of chance seedlings where the exact parentage is unknown. We just say this is an Ilex putative hybrid, and we can go ahead with that on that basis alone. We do want some information on the origin, the age, the size, the shape of the original plant, but we'd ask you to send digital photos and be prepared to send samples at the right time of year, either in the spring when the males are in flower, or in the case of females, later in the year, perhaps November, December, when the fruit color you believe has peaked. And introducing the last point there, we continue to waive all the fees for this. We want to get registration done. We don't want any obstacles at all to registration. So where do I find these newly registered hollies in the time we have left? How are we on time now?
We're good.
We're good. I want to go through a list of some of the more recently registered hollies, just the ones that are here behind me on the tarp that you can buy later this afternoon. We've gone to some trouble in selecting to pack in our car the newly registered plants so that you can get these new ones. Alabama Lady. Is Ray here? I thought I saw Ray earlier, but perhaps he didn't make it down at this time this morning. I have a soft spot in my heart for Alabama Lady. Ray was growing this one for 25 years. And he kept saying, I'd like to give you this holly. I'd like you to try this one out. See if you think it's worthwhile. And Ray, of course, is known for his rhododendrons. And he said, the one thing I've learned in my life, there's a lot of rhododendrons out there that have got names on them that don't deserve it. So he was very reluctant to name and introduce this holly, but it is spectacular. It's just gorgeous. And Alabama Lady is the name he gave to it. It is an open pollinated seedling of Mary Nell, one of over 2,000 such Mary Nell seedlings that Tom Dodd Jr. grew, but most of them were never named, never registered. And this one is here. Ray brought, I think, 2 very nice plants. Nice, large, glossy leaves and lots of pretty red fruit. Forest Totem, this is an Opaca from Sue Hunter. She registered this one in 2019, and look at that beautiful fastigiate form of Forest Totem there. It arose, you said, from an island in the Susquehanna River, is that right? Just a really unique form that is carried through propagation, so the cuttings that you grow. This is one of our test hollies, so after our presentations, be sure and grab one there while supplies last. And we'll see how it grows. A very nice plant there. Boiler Boy, this is one of mine. It was one of our test hollies 2 years ago, registered in 2022, and this happened to be the last one that Mike Ponte registered and put his name on for us. And I'm happy to say it's been chosen as the Holly of the Year for next year. It's a nice, upright, very fast-growing male American holly with somewhat glossy leaves, named after Boiler, who is my son's dog. So there's a picture of me with Boiler. Boiler is the handsome one. But it was named after him because the tree was planted out in his yard, and he would go out on a walk, and I'd always say, Boiler, let's go see your tree. And he would walk out and enjoy the walk out there. Perhaps he fertilized it as well, but we won't say. Sundown, another one from Sue Hunter, selected from near your nursery, another chance
Right
seedling?
on my property.
Right there?
Right on my property at the edge of the woods.
Right there. So you've got a tremendous gene pool to select from. And this points out the value of growing out seedlings, because sometimes these chance seedlings that pop up everywhere, it seems, in your yard, in your garden, in your neighbor's lawn, in the cracks in the sidewalk, sometimes they turn out to be something really spectacular. And that plant, except for taking cuttings, has never been pruned, right?
Correct.
Right. Isn't that an amazing form, Sundown? And it has been chosen as the Holly of the Year for 2026, so the year after this. Very nice fruiting even when it's young. So that little plant in a container, look at those fruit on there. Bear Crossing, this is one of mine. Actually the first holly that I registered in 2003 was my first detailed introduction to Mike Ponte and the registration process. It came up alongside railroad tracks near a railroad crossing in the town of Bear, where I live, and had been used as a source of simply wild cut greens for Christmas time decorations. We have these in the auction also. Sue has propagated these. Dan Fenton, I told you about this. We wish it hadn't been named Dan Fenton. It is a really wonderful holly, very glossy American holly leaves. So much so, I had a nurseryman visit my yard once, looked at it, and he said, "That's not an American holly." He said, "I've grown a lot of American hollies. That's not an American holly." Oh, yes, it is. And Ellen Horton would tell you that. That's a picture of him at the Dawes Arboretum in about 2008, perhaps, something like that. Standing next to one of the very nice old specimens of Dan Fenton. It was introduced in 1987 on the 40th anniversary of the Holly Society's founding. Bill Cool introduced Leroy's favorite, who just registered last year. He didn't originate that plant. It was actually Stuart McLean's plant. Stuart McLean had this holly, and he always thought that it was a really nice Chinese holly, Ilex cornuta, and named it after Leroy Mathai, who was his neighbor's son, a very strong young man who could dig trees like no one else could dig in the nursery. Whether it was really his favorite and he thought it was a nice plant, or that was sarcastic because it is very spiny, and he probably didn't enjoy getting stuck by the plant, but it has a lovely fruit set. It's also very hardy compared to most Ilex cornuta. And Lady Spike is another one of Bill's introductions. It is a hybrid of unknown origin, and again, as I said, we do register plants without knowing their exact parentage once they have shown that kind of potential. Isn't that amazing? I've been growing this now since, even before registration, and it really does look like that, the whole plant. Amazing. Bill Cannon. I think a lot of you knew Bill. Bill grew hollies for probably 70 years. And he told me in 2022 that in all the time he grew hollies, there was only one he thought was good enough to name after his wife, Nancy. And he asked Mike Ponte, and then he asked me to help him register this for him, for the Holly Society. We got the registration done in very early 2023, and then we lost Bill and Nancy both later that year. Bill never got the plant into circulation. He never got it into the hands of professional propagators for any kind of numbers. We're trying to fix that. He did mail me some cutting wood in 2020. In the height of the pandemic, he sent me plants to try to root. And I have one here, one rooted cutting for this auction. Orange You Pretty, completely unknown parentage. One of mine that has these orange red fruit, very fast growing, very vigorous plant. Parentage, I do not know. Probably some latifolia in its background, maybe some cornuta, maybe who knows what. Wavecrester is the first of an interesting series of plants from Bob Tomeyer's nursery in Fenville, Michigan, Wavecrest Nursery. Bob Tomeyer did a controlled cross between Ilex spinosa, which was hardy in Zone 5 in Michigan, and Ilex meserve Blue Prince as the male. And from that, he got over 125 seedlings that he kept. He discarded many others. 5 minutes? And he only named one in his lifetime. His daughter Carol Hopp picked up a bunch of these, named them, and began to introduce them through Wavecrest. And we have introduced Wavecrester, Blue West Hollies. Be sure to take one of those. Stormy, which is another of that series. And Shimmering Lights, a male, all from the same cross. Beautiful glossy foliage, hardy down into Zone 5, parts of Zone 5. Very nice plants. A couple of others I've introduced, Dasher and Dancer. These are semi-dwarf or dwarf cultivars. They may not ever be commercially important, but if you like small plants, if you have only room for a very tiny plant, or maybe something in a container, you might want to consider those. Skinny Atlas from Bill Cool, a male, very heavy flowering, and characteristically thin leaves. Mr. Bob, another of his, a more tree form, early blooming, heavy flowering. And Sled Run, this is a flower making machine. This plant produces so many flowers. It just is more white than green when it's in flower, and very fragrant. Irish Eyes, a female. We have a couple of small plants here. And our newest introduction, the very newest registration, Janet Bigelow for the University of Tennessee Arboretum Society has registered Jan's Jade, named after our own Jan Superzinski. And we have one plant, a small plant, in the auction here today. We'll try to get some more next year. And that's it. I'll stop there. And
Questions?
do we?
Jim?
Can we take questions, or do you want to hold them?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Hey,
Tom?
Jim,
Yes.
how do you handle the reconcile difference between like trademark and marketing names and registered names?
Okay. Strictly speaking, we don't touch trademarks. Trademarks are a separate kind of legal entity that we are not supposed to have anything to do with. It creates no end of confusion, especially because recently the trend has been for something that people want to make a big deal out of commercially and do a lot of marketing. They put a nonsensical sounding name as the botanical name in single quotes. And then they put a really flashy, nice sounding name that they can put on a plant label as a trademark and register that trademark with the U.S. Patents Office, right? And frequently then they'll also patent something, which further complicates our lives. But that has nothing to do with registration either. Technically, we're not supposed to have anything to do with those trademarks. We do track them though, and we very much discourage anybody from naming another holly something that might confuse it with those trademarks. So we try to stay away from that.
How long do they last, trademarks?
Trademarks can go almost indefinitely as long as they keep paying the renewal fees. So, you know, a product like Kleenex, for example, is still, it is a tissue product, but the Kleenex name, they keep renewing it, and they defend that vigorously. So a trademark is almost indefinite.
Are they registering those plants?
Unfortunately, no. They almost never do. And we'd love to change that, but I think they feel that they're getting enough publication otherwise.
So Jim, further distinguish the difference between trademark and patent, because it's two different
Okay,
things where
yes.
you have to pay a royalty to propagate
Right,
a patented plant.
Right, so, you know, it's a whole nother talk on patents, right?
Yeah.
But within the US, you can plant patent a new plant. This prohibits anyone else from reproducing the plant asexually by cuttings or layering or whatever, vegetative reproduction. And that patent can last for 20 years. It cannot be extended, unlike a trademark. And during the patent lifetime, the patent owner has exclusive rights to the propagation, but if they also have the right to sell you the right to propagate those. They might say, if you want to grow one, you have to put my name on it, and you have to pay me so much royalty per plant that you propagate. Those can be from a few pennies up to a few dollars, depending on the plant and how valuable it is to them. But again, patents, they only go out 20 years. The name can be, the trade name, can be extended indefinitely. So even though a patent expires after 20 years, in year 21, you can propagate all you want, but you may not be able to use the name that it's become known by in the trade, because that's actually a trade name and not the botanical name. That's the short version.
No, short version. Any more questions
Dong
for
Lin?
Jim?
Jim, I just wonder, when you name the register number, registration number,
Mm-hmm.
so you have this year, the first one is 1 dash the year,
Yes.
which is, I don't know, it's very hard to search in the database when you try to say which year, because all the first one will come out on the top.
Ah,
So I do suggest it, maybe make amendment and put those year first, then,
hmm.
then it's much easier for people.
Easier to search, to see, to order.
Yeah, to make order, when you search the database or look something, you know, oh, Jim 19, 20,
Ah, I
19.
see.
Then.
And perhaps use all 4 digits instead of just
Yes,
24, we would 2024.
yeah, this probably.
Good idea.
Better, well, I just make suggestions
Mhm.
because it's,
Good idea.
and you can check, otherwise, if you search, first registration come out.
Oh, the ones, yes.
Yeah, yeah, so something like those, I think is we can change it
Yeah.
because the others, it kind of seems, you know, registration have their roles.
Good idea. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to close this down.